Well, Brad, this was terrific. Thank you very, very much. As you said at the outset, your objective was to persuade everybody. You've obviously persuaded me. I stuck with you for 7 years to study. But also in the little op-ed I did in the New York Times a couple weeks ago, it's in your packet, I emphasized your proposals as one of three that I thought could fuel a whole new U.S. jobs creation strategy. Whether 3 million is right, I was a piker. I said maybe a quarter of that from this area, but a big component of a possible U.S. strategy to look to the booming world economy, the emerging markets that are half the world growing more than 6%, while we struggle to get to. I think what you've pointed to got to be a big component of any sensible U.S. job strategy, growth renewal strategy, looking out 5 to 10 years. So I'm a big fan, as you know, and big supporter of what you say. But let me be devil's advocate and ask one maybe tough question right at the start. Your final concluding observation, you said the one thing might worry you is the rest of world catch-up. So analytically, what you've provided us with to a large, and due to the data availability, you pointed out at the outset, but what you've provided us with to a large extent is a snapshot of the current world. You weren't able to do time trends except in a couple of areas. So clearly what you propose as a strategy is something the US should have done 30 years ago. In fact, if one wants to be a real mercantilist, take one of your points, the US led the world in opening markets for manufacturers where we don't have comparative advantage, and didn't do much on services where we do have comparative advantage. And so a skeptic could say the US got it wrong for the last 30, 40 years in mercantilist terms. Now you're suggesting that we're still on that path, and so we still ought to go for it. How confident are you? And obviously, to take the policy course you recommend, and I endorse it, you said it's going to be hard work. It'll take 5 years, the Doha round, 10 years, not much outcome. This is tough, maybe even tougher, so say it's 5 to 10 years. By the time we got through that, and looking beyond that, are you still confident that the kind of relative payoff for the US would still be anything like the magnitude you suggest today? Do you feel that we would have the capability to provide the people in those 3 million jobs if those markets worldwide were opened up in the way you suggest? Is this still the right strategy for the United States?
Yes, I believe it is. I mean, so I'm a card-carrying trade economist. I believe in open markets. I think that even if we didn't have comparative advantage in services, we would benefit from an open trading regime in services. I think that there are probably, I don't know what the forecast is for skills in the United States. I think we have challenges there. But I guess I believe that it's maybe not just skills that are part of developing comparative advantage in services. It may be kind of a whole suite of institutions that are important to developing competitive service firms. Rule of law, protection of intellectual property, venture capital markets, entrepreneurial freedom, even bankruptcy laws, all those kinds of things that make the U.S., even in the manufacturing sector, we see cutting edge firms in manufacturing that emphasize and take advantage of that broad suite of institutional features of the U.S. economy. So I guess I would expect those to continue to play in the U.S. for the next 2 decades. So I guess I haven't run the numbers, so I'm reluctant to be too adamant about it. But I think it's the right policy. I think think that, what's the alternative? To hunker down and help our manufacturing sector? I'm not sure that's right. I mean, right now there's a lot of talk of, resurgence in U.S. manufacturing. I think that's good. I think that's probably right, but I wonder how long it can be maintained. So just a factoid. So, in rough terms, China's 20% of the world's population. India's 20% of the world's population. The U.S. is about 5% of the world's population. Rough numbers. Okay, what share of global manufacturing output does China produce? I mean, this audience should know it better than any.
Majority, your majority.
No, it's about 20%. Okay, well, I'm using UN data. Okay, I don't know that PPP is the right way to think about cross-country comparisons of manufacturing output. Okay, 20%, what's the US share? It's 20%.
Yeah.
Okay, what's India's share?
5.
3. Okay, so when I say there's more adjustment in manufacturing coming, okay, for India just to punch its weight, I mean, we punch way above our weight in manufacturing output. Right, if India just punches at its weight, that's a big increase in global manufacturing output. I don't know how much dislocation that's going to cause here, but it's going to cause dislocation somewhere. Right? And so, do I think that I want to have public policy push us towards a manufacturing future? It's hard to see how that's good counsel. So I think, open markets, open trading regime, that's the way that, and taking care of our, keeping our own house in order. Let's, save, let's invest. Let's invest in education. Let's educate ourselves. Let's fix, the educational institutions for underserved populations. We need to get everybody in the boat and moving forward.
Well, as a fellow card-carrying trade economist, I think there's no doubt that the liberalization you propose would enhance global welfare. It clearly would enhance the gains to the firms that are involved in the practices. The big question is the impact on individual countries. And that's what you focused on, rightly so. And that, I think, is the big issue we have to continue to analyze and debate. In any event, the floor is open. Brad has put enormous amount of stuff on the table. And so I hope he's inspired lots of questions. Bob and then Ernie. We got a traveling mic. Please identify yourself. Standing mic in the back.
Bob Bastine, Coalition for Service Industries. Brad, we've watched you as you've evolved, worked so hard over a period of, 6 years. First with a short article in response to Blinder, and now with this magnum opus. And it's really phenomenal what you've done, and thank you for a really foundational effort here. Really phenomenal, and the scope of your presentation today is terrific. It gives a lot for us to think about. And Fred, thanks for supporting Brad in this. I think basically I have 2 issues. The first is that in the very first paragraph of your book, you say that services don't get no respect. And that continues to be the case, even though, as you pointed out, we are basically the future of the economy. I was going to ask, and I guess you've answered, how you respond to somebody who says that essentially this economy, the American economy, cannot succeed without a strong manufacturing base. The very idea that we could countenance continued decline in manufacturing employment, even though there could still be very substantial manufacturing output. But I get big arguments with folks who say that there's no way you can just have a services economy. It just has to be a healthy economy, you have to have a strong manufacturing base. And we come up against this all the time in our presentations and our lobbying. How can you obviate, not give importance to the need to build manufacturing jobs, because those are the good jobs, and try to convince people that the jobs you've just pointed to are the really good jobs? It's an uphill battle. It ought to be obvious, but it isn't. It ought to be easy, but it isn't. The second point I want to make is that there's been recent evidence that U.S. FDI in services from affiliates abroad, sales from services affiliates abroad owned by the United States, produce a huge amount. In 2008, according to the USITC, 700,000 jobs were supported by that activity. So we're looking forward to helping you move forward to include Mode 3, to include really the enormous contributions that Mode 3 investment makes to our economy and to jobs here. But thank you very much.
Bob, I'll remember that promise of support when we turn to the next study.
It was a mistake.
No, it's on the record.
So I think that I think that the two questions you pose are probably related, and I don't think we understand whether we need actual production activity to support the rich myriad of supporting service activities. I think that's an open empirical question. You know, you hear it posed many ways. Well, if the production activity moves offshore, does the innovation activity move with it necessarily? And at the board meeting we had, there was a diversity of opinion among the CEOs, people who should know. And it may be that it's driven by technological differences or industry differences. I don't know, but I think that understanding that relationship, what the linkage is between headquarters, innovation, and production, either manufacturing or services, and that's your second part. So, you know, we have started to, or I with some co-authors have started to look at this, you know, what service activities are non-tradable, that we classify as non-tradable. And there are a lot, there's a lot of employment in those. What's interesting about those is some are atomistic, you know, they're barbershops. But others are big, multi-market, big service firms. And what seems to be the distinguishing factor is how important is innovation or intellectual property in the enterprise. And then the question is, how far does that travel? So these are important questions. I think they're related, and I hope we'll know in sooner than 6 or 7 years from now.
But from just to add, from a policy standpoint, Bob, I have found the easy answer is to say it's not a choice. You obviously want to maintain good jobs in competitive U.S. manufacturing industries at the same time that you're doing more because of the lack of attention in the past to promote services. But I don't see why anybody in the policy world or elsewhere would think it's one or the other, but rather there is some degree of mutual reinforcement. We don't know how much, but there's bound to be. So I think from that standpoint, it should not be such a rabid debate as perhaps you describe, and as I know too, it frequently can be. From the Manufacturers Alliance, Ernie Krieg.
Shout or someone else? Ernie Krieg, Manufacturers Alliance. But on your last point, it's obviously true. We need to consider the two sectors together. IBM has revenues from business services comparable to products, for example.
Sure.
And I agree.
Greater than, I think.
Huh? Greater. I believe they're
greater.
greater, but I did want to misstate it.
Yeah.
I've long believed, I appreciate the book, I'm looking forward to reading it. I've long believed that in recent years, business services are highly mobile across borders with great gains from trade, from the companies, from everybody, so that this is a very dynamic area. But my question, and it's a brief couple facts and leading to a question, it's not so much 5 or 10 years ahead. I never go try to say what the dollar exchange rate is going to be to the yuan 10 years from now. But I believe it's not current necessarily, your charts, which go back to 07, whereas a lot of things have been changing in the last 3 to 5 years, particularly India, China, and these companies with millions of students abroad in the U.S. and elsewhere doing engineering, all of these things, financial services. So the dynamic may be moving a lot faster, and it's a much bigger challenge to the U.S. For that. And just a couple of facts. For example, this year, first 8 months or so, our exports of services have been going something in the order of 10 or 15% growth. India, it's 40%, and that's been going on for 3 or 4 years now. Another fact is on the U.S. imports, it's, as you know as well as better than I, there are a lot of faults, including grossly understating imports from India of business services by about 90%. and there's a GAO study that shows us. The reason is we don't count sales by subsidiaries of Indian multinational business companies, but they do 90% of their business that way, and they're not counted. So we say 3 billion. The NASCOM, their industry association, says 30 or 40 billion a year. So there's some real big questions about statistics. And finally, on a statistic, last year, 2009, the WTO figures for so-called other commercial services, leave out transportation and travel, and we'll get to 2010 in the next few weeks, show that still, though, over 50% of global exports of business services, the EU was first, we were second, Japan, but then India, and there's 4 or 6 others moving up. Japan, India, China, South Korea, Taiwan. India is close to overtaking Japan to be number 3. I predict in 2 or 3 years they'll be number 3, especially if they grow 40% a year. So this thing is moving quite rapidly. And just to show that I have some policy conclusions too. Just one, several months ago I did a study, a few of you are aware of it, which was entitled "The Growing U.S. Interest in a Free Trade Agreement with India." Because manufacturers, we're losing big time market share. Everybody else has FTAs and China's just coming on gangbusters. There was some discussion on services in there, but what you've done today is you've made the case much more strongly, that, particularly with India being so restrictive, that a free trade agreement with India is not only obviously in the interest of U.S. manufactured exports, but also very much so in terms of more and more competitive competition with India in business services. You may want to comment.
Yeah, I think India's, somebody had to ask the India question, right? Because the story I've told you seems at odds with India. Why is it that India, which is, sure, there are lots of very well-educated Indians, but if you put in the denominator all the people who are, functionally illiterate, I mean, if you saw that last chart, I mean, India looks like China 20 years ago. So it is not an educational, abundant economy. There are a lot of smart people who are really well educated. I don't mean to deny that. But in terms of how we think about kind of the factor abundance of skill in India, it is not a skill abundant country. So why is it that they export services? How can that be? And there I think it goes to, well, look at they should make stuff, right? They should make shirts. They should make tennis shoes. And they don't. And why is that? And I think it's Indian domestic regulation that they have imposed on their manufacturing sector since independence that has crippled their manufacturing sector. They only account for 3% of global manufacturing output. They are liberalizing. All that very capable engineering talent that is providing services around the world, those people should be managing factories. Right? And as soon as India liberalizes its manufacturing sector, as it is now doing, it's going to bid up wages, and those people are going to get sucked out of services and into manufacturing. And I think that will solve that mystery. Okay, and then India won't export services; they'll export stuff, and it'll go back to the U.S. and the EU and Japan. They export services, and India, and China is, if you saw that picture, the 20 to 25 to 29-year-olds in China, they look a lot more like the developed world in terms of educational attainment. So 20 years from now, China's a middling country. And maybe so I don't know what that looks like, but in the short to medium term, I think that India will no longer be the powerhouse in services exports that they currently are, just as they liberalize. And it has nothing to do with what happens in services. It's all about what happens in their manufacturing sector.
Welby? Yeah.
You focused on modes.
Please identify.
Oh, yes. Welby Layman from Ways and Means Majority Trade Staff. That you focused on modes 1, 2, and 4. And our trade agreements focus on modes 3 and 1. with a bit of 2 and 4 thrown in, but not much because of concerns about movement of peoples and how it's caught up in visa politics. Bob's already made the case using the ITC study that Mode 3 is worth focusing on. I wanted to ask about Modes 2 and 4 and how important they are. You've focused on 1, 2, and 4. Talk specifically about 2 and 4, movement of peoples, and how much we're losing because of that particular concern about including movement of peoples. And then I also wanted to add in a little comment. I think it's sort of interesting how your other big concern about the United States moving down in that educational attainment category is a factor of our exporting a Mode 2 service.
So I don't have a number. I couldn't, right now it's not in the book, scope out of that employment what's Mode 1, Mode 2, or Mode 4. So I don't have a sense of that. I guess my more overwhelming sense is that how business services are provided is it's not 1 or 2 or 4, it's 1 and 2 and 4. You know, that it's a more complex delivery. And it may even require Mode 3 to do it. So parsing them, I think, is difficult. I mean, so I guess that's, Mode 3 is important. I don't mean to deny it. It was just methodologically, I couldn't get any traction on it in the way that I approached the question here. Not to say that it's not important. It's just the way I went after it, I wouldn't have much to say about it. So I'll stop. I guess I won't say anything about it.
Okay, Joe, and then one up here, and then Bob.
Okay. Yeah, Joe Gagnon, Peterson Institute. Brad, it's not a question for you, but rather interpreting or adding to what you said from a more macroeconomic perspective to see if you would agree that this actually strengthens the conclusion of your book in a way. Fred had asked you how nervous were you about the catch-up of some countries and whether that would take away our advantage in services. But, I mean, if we step back and think about the macro environment, I worry that a lot of the concern people have is about the trade deficit or the aggregate trade deficit rather than the shift in comparative advantage. And if we think that going forward, the aggregate, according to IMF data, the aggregate sort of currency manipulation, if you will, of the developing world right now is about $1.2 trillion per year. This is governments in emerging markets that are buying financial assets in the US and Europe. And we know that in a general, and that doesn't even include sovereign wealth funds, so the true total is probably $1.5 trillion. That's about 10% of US GDP or 5% of US and European GDP. We know that that roughly has to equal the trade deficit because the accounts have to balance. The only thing left is private capital flows, but in fact they're quite small relative to these numbers, and they go in the wrong direction. So if you get to a point where that stops, and then we go back to trade balance, which is what we all want, then surely the point is just going to be that, well, we're going to have to be exporting more of something. And we'll be much better off if we keep importing these cheap goods but export the business services rather than not exporting the business services and having to re-bring back production of goods we stopped producing before into our shores. I mean, surely of those two outcomes, one of them is going to happen, and we know that it's much better. And regardless of what the educational achievement is of the rest of the world, still we'll be joined by the people in that comparative advantage camp, but there's still going to be our comparative advantage in that area, right, relative to manufacturing. So it seems to me that it strengthens the point of your book. We want to focus the adjustment that's coming in this area.
Time is short, so
Amen.
let's take that as a comment, right? Amen. We'll get two more, one here and then Bob.
Hidde Huben from the EU Embassy here. I have a question about how you translate your work into practical negotiations, whether it's in Geneva or elsewhere, but to really get the liberalization going. Because I think that if you compare services with goods, goods are relatively easily negotiated.
Put the mic up.
because you establish a benchmark for reducing tariffs, and it's either zero or it's by a given percentage, 30%, 50%, and then subsequently you look at products and you average it out and you get to a certain tariff reduction. Now, anybody who's seen a services schedule knows that it takes about 5 months, 6 months just to understand what's in the schedule. And it's extremely difficult to actually find an objective way of benchmarking and quantifying liberalization by third countries who have barriers. So I think that in terms of what would be extremely useful to try and develop is an instrument whereby you could say, well, this is, and I know this because in the Doha round, nobody was able to quantify what the objective in terms of liberalizing services would be. We all agreed on what they would be in agriculture, in the different boxes. We more or less agreed what they would be in industrial tariffs, but we got terribly lost on services because nobody could quantify or benchmark liberalization. And the net result was that at the political level, people spent maybe 5-10% of their time on services and 60-70% of their time on goods and agriculture. So I think there's a real problem in terms of the complexity of services schedules and finding a coherent way in which you can agree around the table on benchmarks to liberalize services. And I don't know whether you have any sort of silver bullet for that, but if you would, it would be very useful for trade negotiations.
That may need to be our next study. Let's get Bob's question on the table, and then Brad can answer all of the above.
Bob Samuelson, Washington Post. One of the charts you showed, and it's on page 113, shows the surplus in services going back to 1992. And if you look at that chart, it's just been a very slow increase. The surplus is not all that much greater than it was in 1992. And I'm wondering if we have such a great comparative advantage, even with the restrictions on the trade and services, you would think that the demand for our services would be going up radically, given the growing affluence of a lot of these economies around the world. And yet that does not seem to be reflected in the surplus in services. And so my question is, how come?
Okay, Brad.
So I think the last two questions are probably related. I think it's an open question why we don't export more. I tried to give some sense that there is a thicket of policy impediments to services exports. I guess I would suggest that measuring service exports and measuring service imports is very difficult. And it's not clear that we are providing the level of resources to the statistical agencies that need to be provided to measure it well. I think we're, largely in the dark. And who knows how biting or how binding or how constraining the thicket of impediments is. You look for anecdotal evidence, and you do see that, so in the book I mentioned this Songdo International Business District, which is being built outside of Seoul, South Korea. It is a tens of billions of dollar real estate development project. It's basically a whole city that they're building. And the lead architects and the lead developers are American firms. All the second tier providers, services and goods, are US firms. Okay, and then there's this Lavasa development in India. Again, it's building a city from scratch. And it's a different set of lead American firms. American architecture firms based in Missouri and Maryland. Whereas Songdo, I think, was Kohn Pedersen Fox. So it is happening. How that's being measured in the official statistics, I'm not sure. And again, it may be how we classify mode 1, mode 2, and mode 4 versus mode 3. I am not as expert in the national income and product accounts. I think this has to do with Ernie Craig's point about the diversity of opinion between India's IT exports and US IT imports. It's kind of how we think about it and what framework we use. So that's complicating. I think there's a lot of hard work to do on measuring service impediments. To answer your question, I've tried to put forward, my best effort for how to think about this. This is certainly not the end. I hope it just spurs more work, more data collection, more thinking about, how we open this up.
Bob, just to add one point, you suggested a reason why we would have expected the U.S. services surplus to get bigger over time, and that would be the implication of Brad's work. There might be a reason why we would have expected it to get smaller, which is that for most of the period since 1992, the dollar has been substantially overvalued on any analysis of the type we do here. And partly as a result of that, the manufacturing trade deficit has gotten much worse. So you might say, well, services did pretty well to hold its own, even rise a little, when the price relationships were working against the U.S. Now that raised another research question. What is the price elasticity of a lot of these services sectors? That's another natural follow-on, I think, from the work Brad did. He didn't focus on tourism, which is a huge services sector.
Right.
Tourism, I happen to know from previous work, is one of the most price elastic of all components of international trade. The price elasticity of tourism trade runs as high as 8, compared with a normal 1.5 or 2 in most good sectors. Just look at the shift between Mexico and the Caribbean when those exchange rates moved, or before the euro between Greece and Italy. Huge swings in response to currency changes. Now, I don't know whether architectural services and those kinds of industries that Brad talks about here are price sensitive or not. But that's a factor that might cut in the other way. It's certainly an element for future research. Brad, we could probably go on all day. Lots of more questions. Apologies to those of you who had them, but we want to stick to our closing time. We've already gone over a little bit. I want to just end where I started. This was a really major project for us at the Institute, kind we normally don't do, but we thought it was hugely important. We thought Brad was uniquely the person to do it. I think what he's produced at this point has more than amply justified that outcome. I'm very proud of the study, delighted with what Brad's done. I hope it really does lead to some changes in thinking about this, and I'm sure it's going to spawn additional follow-on research in major ways. And Brad, I just want to say we're deeply in your debt. We thank you for what you've said today.